Dear students, welcome back to Property Law. So it's HOE 6011. Sorry, I still have to keep on checking it. So we're looking at property law aspects. Now, last time I completed lecture note 1A, and if you see, I've also put up some information. There was this video about possession and the right to self-defense, which, as I understand, you need to sign into YouTube because apparently it's too violent. So I hope you were able to check it. Then there is some information about a trust, and well, this is also from the notes. But a trust is a very fascinating thing. I put in the UK perspective and the US perspective. It's not something that has taken off very well in continental Europe under the civil law system. But as you can see from the US perspective, there are amazing tax savings that can take place. Now, just remember, I mean, of course, you will read everything. There are certain aspects to keep in mind regarding a trust, and that would be, well, number one is, of course, the fact that there is a rich person, he or she has a lot of money, and now what to do with the money? Well, so now the object of the trust would be a beneficiary, yeah, and so the beneficiary would be, I don't know, let's say there is Mr. Hilton, grandfather Hilton, Mr. Hilton, and now their daughter or the granddaughter is Paris Hilton. And well, there's a lot of money in the family, yeah, hundreds of millions of euros, and lots of hotels everywhere and everything. But they also know that Paris Hilton will probably end up blowing up all this money in 2 months. So you have to control this somehow. Yeah. So the trust is such that grandfather Hilton makes a trust and puts 100 million into it. And now the beneficiary is, of course, Paris Hilton, and she would get €1 million a year, you know, from this trust, for example, for her expenses. And then there are trustees, and these trustees would be, private individuals whose job is to make sure that number one, the trust money stays safe. Number two, the beneficiary gets her 1 million every year. And number three, this trust money is put into some schemes or stock market or some safe options so that the money keeps on multiplying, not just reducing. And sounds like a good idea. Of course, you have different types of trusts. You have a private trust, which in this case would be a family trust, or you could have a public trust. A public trust could be, well, I have 100 million, so I appoint a trust and have trustees, and their job is to find the top 5 universities in Europe and to give each university 1 million euros as grants or scholarships every year. Yeah, that's a public trust open for the public, no private considerations here. And of course, they are taxed differently, regulated differently. But you also have to understand that this can be amazing from a taxation perspective, because coming back to the Paris Hilton Trust, so the $100 million, who do they belong to? Do they belong to Paris Hilton? No, she's just a beneficiary. She gets the money, 1 million a year. Does the money belong to the grandfather, Mr. Hilton? No, he gave it to the trust. A trust is a separate legal entity. Does the money belong to the trustees? No, they are just there to take care of the money and make sure it goes to the right people end of the year, every year. So who owns the money? We don't know. Who gets taxed? Well, that's a tricky question here. And of course, if you were to now put this trust, let's say, in a location, maybe in Panama or in the British Virgin Islands, or some such tax haven, now you could end up having a lot of things. So a lot of like, for example, very rich Arab billionaires who own properties in the UK. Well, the property is not in their name. The property is in the name of a trust which has been set up somewhere offshore. And who are the who are the trustees, who are in charge? Where does the money come from? Where does the money go? It becomes a very crazy situation. Nobody can understand it. And of course, uh, a penny saved is a penny taxed. So you could have multiple properties all around the world. You could have airlines, you could have a special yacht, you could have all sorts of things, and nothing is in your name. It's all in the name of some trust set up by another trust, set up by a company, set up by somebody, and nobody understands where the money comes from or where the money goes. So this is a speciality, of course, of English common law, and it's been adopted in various other common law countries. And I believe even in Germany there was a scandal because the heiress of the Mercedes family fortune had a similar arrangement, and the German government was not very happy about it, obviously. But you see, this is a very important element of handling property. So I put it up over there just for you all to know. So we continue and we're looking at some fundamental ways of acquiring ownership. Now, this is of course not so much in the private context, but more in a more wider, bigger context. So the old way of doing things was discovery and occupancy. Yeah, you discover a new territory. Now, let's say you are Christopher Columbus. You go around the world or wherever you go by ship, and you reach some place and you think it's India, and you put the flag of the Spanish government or the Portuguese government, and then you say, well, you have discovered this property, and now it belongs to this land. Territory belongs to your country or your sovereign or your monarch or whoever. So that's discovery. And then of course also occupancy. So for example, the British, well, they set up these colonies in the United States. If you remember your history, this was before the United States became United States. Of course, there were these 13 colonies in North America, all across the coastline, and these were British colonies. And so based on that, they claim that they are possessing this property on behalf of the British Empire or the British king. And similarly, the French sent some ships and they set up some colonies, I believe, in New Orleans, that part, Florida side. Then the Spanish were very involved. They controlled Mexico and Texas and all sorts of things. So of course, these are different theories, and of course, the same went when the British occupied Australia, for example. Yeah, so you have this colonialism, and that's how it works out. So, well, the way this is seen is there are different stages to human interaction with respect to land or property. One is, the age of hunters. So the humans were just hunting, hunter gatherers. Yeah, remember the hunter gatherer diet, which has less carbohydrate, yeah, more meat and more protein and stuff. So of course, you hunted, and um, you know animals got over in one part of the forest, you went to the other part of the forest, and so you just roamed around. Then you had the age of shepherds, still have them, the Sami people in northern parts of Europe, North Finland, North Sweden, North Norway, northern parts of Russia, along the Arctic Circle. So they have their own cattle or reindeer, and so they have a pastoral lifestyle. Then there was the age of agriculture, which is now really a situation where you need to determine who owns the land, because you're going to be here in this land and you're not mobile anymore, and so property rights are now more important. In the previous ages, one tribe owned all the land up to this river, and the other tribe owned all the land up to that mountain. Yeah, so that's how it was in a loose sense. And the whole community owned things, nobody individually owned anything. But now with the age of agriculture, you have individual farms, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, feudal parts, and then the whole uh, system, social system around it. And then of course then you have the age of commerce, which is more like where you have private enterprise, and people have private homes, and all of these things that come in over here. So if you look at it from that viewpoint, private property only came into existence or came to be essential at the stage when people became less mobile. yeah, and you are more rooted to the country, to the ground, and your life revolves around the farm or the factory and things like that. So that was straightforward. Another way of acquiring ownership in a fundamental sense, of course, is capture. And capture could mean, well, you're a hunter and it's an open public forest and you see this animal running around, so you shoot it, capture it, alive or dead, and now it belongs to you because it never belonged to anybody else. So, of course, this analogy was also taken into account in a different way with regard to migratory resources. Yeah, so let's say I have a big field and I'm sitting in my field, and I see all these ducks flying on top, and I just shoot at one, and it falls onto my land, so well, I own it. Now, this migratory aspect could also be taken into account with things like oil and gas. Now, well, in a classroom, I would have drawn this for you, but let's say this is the surface of the land here. Okay, this is it, and now below is a big giant oil reserve or a gas reserve, yeah, a couple of kilometers down. And of course it's liquid and it's an air pocket or a liquid pocket, and well, all of this is land on top. So now let's say the land is divided in like this, so there's a fence in between and A owns this part and B owns this part. And now let's just say that A sets up an oil derrick, and sucks out the oil. So for example, from here, yes, and this often came about in Texas, for example, when they had the oil boom, and so now what's going on here is that all the oil is getting sucked up by the pipe and the pump that has been put in by A. And of course, B may not be happy about it because you see, although some of this oil reserve is under his land also, it's migratory. He can't do anything. This is now a war of the pumps. Who has a more powerful pump can suck out the oil. So again, the same questions that dealt with how a wild animal can be owned now go into other areas such as this. So of course you have certain legal principles that came about. For example, whoever owns the soil owns the heaven up and down all the way to hell. So well, that didn't really matter much when this Latin saying came about 1,000 years ago because who cares about such things. But now of course it's much more relevant and quite a problem, especially with all these new resources that keep on coming up. When you're looking at minerals, well, then that's not an issue because that's solid. It's a coal mine or a graphite mine or what, lead or whatever. It's all there, gold deposits or diamonds. They don't move around underground. But oil resources, gas resources, water resources, groundwater, for example, all of these are because of the physics, the dynamics, it's quite an issue dealing with especially ownership. And so of course, what can an owner do if we believe that if you own the land, you own whatever is up and whatever is down? Could you stop a plane from flying over your land? Now this can often be a problem. In some places, if you own big enough property, then you can always say that no air routes should be allowed over my property. But we are talking about a really big property here, maybe 2,000 hectares or something. And this happens in the United States in some places or in Canada. I don't see that happening in Europe because who owns 2,000 hectares in Europe anymore? Well, so of course this is relevant, and often these conflicts come up. So I'll try to put up some videos over here, and one of the videos is regarding drones. People have this crazy idea that they have a drone and they think they can fly over wherever and go over whoever's garden and pond or swimming pool, and the air is free and sky belongs to everybody. Well, no, not really. But then of course there are sometimes situations where neighbors have conflicts, and then If you have a shotgun, then whether you're shooting a duck or you're shooting a drone, it's the same principle. So it's not a difficult proposition. You fire in the air and the drone comes down, just like you fire in the air and a duck comes down. So when you look at this thing, who's responsible? A drone could cost €1,000. So if you are trespassing with your drone, I mean, you are somewhere else, but the drone is on somebody's property, and what if that person gets upset and then damages your drone by shooting at it? Then who will be responsible? But of course, it's much more relevant also in the context of groundwater, and this often causes a lot of disputes. And in the United States, especially, you have a lot of problems with groundwater. And I even know that, for example, if you buy an older farm in Texas, for example, then you have better access to groundwater rights, whereas new owners of property cannot drill a bore well, or a tube well into the ground, because water is a precious resource. And so the older properties sell for a much higher price, because not only you get the property, a piece of desert, but you also get that well, deep well, which has access to water. And of course, as you know, without water, there's not much that you can do. So even the Estonian Property Act provides for ownership. Specifically, Section 134 states that immovable property ownership does not extend to groundwater. Again, 127 also refers to how much you own above or below your land. Then comes a very important aspect of acquiring ownership, and that is by finding. So you're a finder, you found something. And of course, this is not straightforward and simple, because I have given even some examples of all of these things, which maybe will make quite a lot of sense. So property can be characterized as lost, mislaid, abandoned, or a treasure trove, and all four of these have different connotations. So let's say you are traveling in a bus, and you forget your wallet or your mobile phone. So now, what are your rights vis-a-vis the finder? So of course, that's a very important aspect to keep in mind. Similarly, let's say you are in a bus, and now you have something stupid, Valentine's Day gift from somebody who you now hate. And what do you do with this? Well, of course, you could throw it in the rubbish, but you're a green person and you don't want to throw things in rubbish. So what do you do? Well, you leave it in the bus, or in a cab, or in a train, somewhere public, in a park, hoping that you don't want it, but somebody else may find a use for it. Now, in this situation, what are the rights of you have given it up? The rights of the finder, the rights of the person on whose property this is found. So again, very important elements. The same would go, for example, let's say you are walking in Kobamaya, some shopping mall, and you find a €500 note fallen on the ground. What do? Do you just pick it up? Is it yours? Who does it belong to? So these are all important elements, and some of these can have quite a lot of far-reaching consequences. I put up some examples, especially over here. For example, there were some of these incidents related with shipwrecks. So there's a ship and the ship sinks. So what? Well, some of these cases are quite peculiar. So there was this 400-year-old ship, 400 years ago. So it was a Spanish ship, and it was the Spanish conquistadors had looted, robbed, stolen, or whatever, gold from Peru or Chile somewhere, and then it went all the way to Panama, and then from there by ship, this gold was now being taken to Spain, and well, it's a long journey, and somewhere along the journey there was a storm, and the ship got blown, and then it sank somewhere in the Caribbean, a bit near Florida, but of course not next to Florida, quite far, but still, in that area. And so that's it. Ship sinks in a storm 400 years ago, and it's in very deep water. So what? Nothing can be done anymore, right? Now, well, then came the whole concept of nation states and national maritime boundaries, and I'm sure you must have studied. Where does the national boundary end? Is it, in Estonia? Where does it end? In Finland, where does it end? Is it on the shoreline, or you go another 11 kilometers or something like that? And then you have the territorial waters, then you have the exclusive economic zone, blah blah blah. All right. So anyway, the same people who found the Titanic, it's a big business. It's a risky business. You're looking for something that sank hundreds of years ago in the deep ocean somewhere. So they have just some estimates or something. And so anyway, this company based in the US from Florida, they used all the sensors and mini submarines and everything, and they actually found the location of this ship. It was in international waters, yeah, which means doesn't belong to anybody, only the finder then, yes. And so they spent almost $1 million, did the whole excavation part and sent divers and pulled out all the gold and everything, whatever else they could find. And now this is a ton of money. Yeah, it's a lot of money. So of course everybody got involved, and the Spanish government said, "Hey, wait a minute, thank you. This ship belongs to us, so the gold belongs to us." And the Americans were like, "No, we found it. It's 400 years ago, so it belongs to us." And the Spanish said, "No, no, no. This is the name of the ship. You found it. You found cannons on the ship, with the name of the ship, and you brought everything up. So this is clearly a Spanish ship." So when this matter went to the court in the US, surprise, surprise, under international law, well, if it's a commercial ship, then of course it's differently treated. But if it is a navy ship belonging to a navy of a country, then it always belongs to the country. And since Spain has been a country for a very long period of time, they were able to prove that this was a Spanish naval ship, because which other ship carries guns? Navy ship carry guns. So based on that, they said, well, the ship had guns, so it's a navy ship. It had gold. The gold belongs to the Spanish navy. Spanish navy belongs to the Spanish state, so the gold belongs to the Spanish state. And the US judge agreed. Yeah, so of course, you see, this is a huge thing, because you're talking about something worth hundreds of millions of euros, and this is big money. One of the reasons why the US has such laws, and the international laws exist, is because during World War II, especially in the Pacific, a lot of American ships were sunk, and aircraft was sunk during the battles with the Japanese. And so the Americans estimate that there are around 50,000 naval Air Force wrecks all across the Pacific Ocean, which contain remains of American soldiers. And so these are living graves, and so the Americans don't want people pulling up these planes or ships and selling the metal, because it can be very lucrative. And so they have signed to this maritime convention, International Maritime Convention, which clearly states that military property is always property of the state. And so the Americans didn't want to upset the Spanish, because it would hurt the Americans later on. And with treasure trove especially, it's a huge area. You have to be really careful about this, especially even under Estonian law, who owns the property, because we often come across these incidents. So it's like there is this treasure, Roman era treasure, 2000 gold coins, or in Estonia, there was this big controversy last year or the year before. They were doing an archaeological dig in Saaremaa, and they found this giant Viking era ship that had been buried in the ground, and it had crowns and gold and swords and whatever. And of course, this thing was almost 1,000 years old. And it's very interesting from a national perspective, because number one, it shows that the Vikings were involved in these parts of Estonia. Number two, that an important Viking king or chieftain had been buried with his ship and all his property. And all of these things are very relevant. And of course, whatever you discover is worth a ton of money. And in this particular case, there was this thing that these were just archaeological digs sponsored by the university and some enthusiasts who come. And although the law says that you are entitled to some finder's fee, you can't get millions or something. The Estonian state will not give you so much money. So there is this whole controversy about how much you should get and what is the value of such things. And some things are priceless. It's a 2,000-year-old gold ring. What is the price of that? I don't know. It's historical, and things like that are very difficult to put a value upon. And in this particular Estonian situation, they also had hired some, not even hired, they had called for some volunteers who were helping out with the archaeological dig. And now this guy who was a volunteer found a crown, and he said he's the finder. Yeah, but the court said you're not the finder. You're just a volunteer working for this research group. And if anybody is the finder, it is the group. And because the group is a public university affiliated group, they're already a part of the government. So nobody gets anything. Maybe your name comes in a newspaper or something like that, but you don't get any money at all in these cases. And this guy was like, no, I found this golden crown, and it's worth 10 million, and I want 10%, and well, it doesn't work out. So of course, legally, that's all provided for, and it's also there in the notes. So make sure you focus on this thing and pay attention to it. Then another way of acquiring ownership is adverse possession, and which is quite a controversial area. Let's just say let's say my grandfather has a flat or has a manor house or something in Saaremaa. And well, it goes to my mom, and then from there it goes to me. Let's just presume I'm Estonian. All right. So okay, after my mom, this property should have come to me, but then my uncle started living in that house, and for 20 years I don't do anything. Yeah. My uncle's living there. I don't care. I go and stay in South America. I go to Antarctica. I go to India. I go everywhere. I do my education. I work, whatever. And finally, I retire and I come back to Estonia. And now 22, 25 years later, I go to my uncle and say, hey, that house you're living in belonged to my mom. So you need to leave it now and give it back to me. Well, it doesn't work like that. It's called adverse possession. And if your uncle has been living in your mom's house for all these years, a certain amount of years, and you have not objected at that point, then now the property belongs to your uncle. Is it legalized theft? Maybe, but actually you're being punished because you are legally lazy. Who takes 25 years to figure out such things? If it's your house, you should have told your uncle straight away, no, you cannot live in my house. Or you should have had some correspondence or sent some legal notices or done something. You can't just wake up 25 years later and say, oh, this property belonged to my mom and her dad, and so it belongs to me. So that's adverse possession. Of course, there are some exemptions over here. Maybe government-owned land is not subject to such things. So again, something to be very careful about. As a lawyer, these are how property disputes start out. And of course, there are the laws of limitation and things. There could also be some other grounds. So let's say the property belonged to my grandfather, and from there it went to my mom. Yeah. But then, this was independent Estonia, 1920s, and then World War II happened, everything. So of course I had to, my mom had to go to Sweden somewhere, and then I was born in India somewhere. And because it's Soviet Union, we can't come back to Saaremaa to claim our house. And now after 40, 50 years, the Soviet Union collapses, and now I can come back. So would that 20, 25-year period start from the time my grandfather died, or would it start from the time when the Estonian state became re-independent? So again, these are all very important elements to keep in mind. but they deal with property, so you have to be aware about these things. So creation of movable property ownership, sea vessels, what happens when you find something, what are the finder's fees, what are your rights as a finder, what about situations where the owner of the property, the immovable property, the land or the house, has more rights than you do. So there are all these examples here you have to be very careful about. So it all depends on whether the property can be considered as lost, mislaid, abandoned, or is a treasure trove. And even if it's a treasure trove, if it has special value, now special has its own connotations, then in that case again it becomes a big issue. In the Estonian property law, this was dealt with under property laws, but now it has gone into a separate historical artifacts legislation. So again, as a lawyer, you can't just focus on one or two subjects. You have to look at things in a holistic manner, and you have to know every possible aspect about things. And this is again something that you have to be very careful about as young lawyers. Just during Christmas time, I was busy in December and beginning of January. I had to do a report for the European Commission, and this was about the new copyright law directive and its implications on the digital single market. Yeah, and so there were some very specific questions about what happens if intellectual property that belongs to me is put up by you on YouTube. Yeah, who's responsible then? So now there's a special European Union directive about this, and all countries in the European Union have to now change their copyright laws and make this provision. So, to give an opinion about this, I needed to know the Estonian Copyright Act, the Estonian Property Law, the Estonian Law of Obligations, Estonian Criminal Law, and then of course there is also there's this information society directive, and besides the Estonian national laws, I also needed to know the European Union directives and regulations. So there are 3 or 4 of those, and how they have been implemented in individual Estonian acts. And then also, of course, case law. So you have this website where you can find out Supreme Court judgments, and then you have to try to sort of draw an analogy and say, okay, in this case it was like this, or like this, like this. So it's about property, of course, intellectual property, and it belongs to X, but it's uploaded by Y onto YouTube, and YouTube is making money and giving you the money, revenue sharing. But what about my rights? So again, and all of these are issues, but the point I'm trying to make here is you can't just answer this question by knowing the property law of your country. You need to know a lot of different legal aspects that go in over here. And I didn't even look into taxation, because that would be another amazing thing. And because this is also new, it's all about the aim of the European Union, just like many other countries, to tax social media giants, who incidentally all happen to be American. So everybody's trying to tax Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. All of these companies make a ton of money, and they don't pay taxes in Europe. They don't pay taxes in the US. They don't pay taxes anywhere. And people like you and me are stupid, and we pay taxes for everything. So of course, all of this is not only related with ownership of property, but also how where it is owned, the jurisdiction, and things like that. So when you talk about property rights, you have to keep a holistic view in mind, everything, not individual cubic holes of information. So there's all this information here, and it's all put up. I've also put up some of these Estonian property law codes over here. So keep all of these in mind and pay attention to each of these, because they have a big role to play in understanding property law and ownership. Now, this is especially a problem sometimes, because when you look at what does it mean to be the owner, well, as the owner, it's a bundle of sticks, so you have different rights. You can be the owner, you can be the landlord, you can be the renter, you can be the licensor. So you can do a lot of things, and they're all interrelated. So you have to keep in mind that ownership really would start from the moment when the state has nothing to do with what you do with this property. The day this property is yours is when nobody else, not even the state, can interfere with your rights regarding this property. And of course, there has to be this balance. And now comes the more tricky question. Sometimes some people own too much, vis-a-vis others, and you may have even noticed about that. There's always this talk about the 1% versus the 99%, and oh, how during the coronavirus pandemic the rich became richer and the poor became poorer. And so very often these sort of talks go on to socialism, and the idea that there should be redistribution of property, and nobody should make too much money, and millionaires should be taxed more than ever, and all of these things. And then of course it goes on to communism, which is the state owns property, not you. End of the story. You're just a worker, and then of course nobody's happy with that, and then again the cycle is repeated. So how do you maximize the value of property? Not by just using it as one thing, but by using it in multiple ways. And so if the relationship between the person and the thing that person owns is shared with others in ways that the ownership remains intact, but the maximum revenue or cost benefits can be applied, then so that's the trick regarding property ownership. But then the bigger question here is, can it be owned? Now this is where the problem arises, because some things are new, and new use for an old thing, for example. And so of course these things can be quite an issue. So especially when you're looking at radio waves, 4G, 5G, how do you own these things? The same even goes, for example, in Australia, you have these religious mountains and hills, which the local Aborigines claim belongs to them. Others say no, it belongs to them. So again, you have a lot of these problems. Again, with biotechnology, the same issues, and the problems that arise with ownership have gotten even more complicated, especially when you look at issues dealing with adoption and viewing human beings as property, or embryos or stem cells as something that can be sold. And so based on that, there is a case study and a homework that goes with it. So I'll talk about this a bit more, but you can already start reading about these things, and I'll put up 2 homeworks today, and then you'll have a month for them, more than a month. So you should be okay, and it should not be a problem. So I'll put up the details, and then we can discuss more about this in the next coming weeks as well. All right. So make sure you read about the points that I've raised today, and especially biotechnology. And I'll add more about that in the coming lectures as well. So thank you for your time, and see you next week. Goodbye.